14 attempts to design the ideal, the incredible, magnificent 35mm M lens for M range rangefinders. M range rangefinders. What's just released? Well, released in the last few months or whatever. Leica finally released. Okay. 60 years of design, millions of man hours of effort, and 14 attempts to get the perfect 35mm lens. 14 attempts. Do you think they got it right to make the best, the ideal 35mm lens for Leica M mount cameras? Do you think they got it right now? Well, I think Leica have done it. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Griniflix Adventure 8 video. This is Peter Zellums, and welcome back. I'm glad that you have come back for another video. Outstanding. Today, it's going to be a special video, as always, or always a special video. Continue with regards to my Leica APO 35mm Summicron f2 lens. And how does this lens compare to the other 35mm lenses that I have? So, for example, the Summicron f2 vintage lens, which is about 1974-75 version. My outstanding Summilux 35mm f1.4. Also my Voigtlander 35mm f1.4 Nokton Classic. And then in the mix I'll throw in this one as well. Nikon 35mm f1.4 AIS lens, about 30 odd years old, I would say. I'll be needing to use a adapter, and in this particular case here it's a F mount adapter to an M mount adapter, and the manufacturer is Gobe. The subject will be this. I'll set up the camera here and we'll be photographing that. So the distance will probably be about 1 meter and a bit in real life, seeing what are the differences between those 5 lenses that I have. And then for those lenses that can do less than 0.7 meter focus range, which will be the Nikon and also the latest Apple 35mm Leica lens, then we can have a look a bit closer as well. Let's get on with the show. Alright, my setup. I'm at 1.2 meters and just taking my reference shots. So that was at f2. Let's move to 2.8. The expectation is that the new Leica APO Summicron is going to be the highest resolution, the highest contrast, the greatest detail, and the most versatile. Okay, all the shots are taken, and I'm hoping that 50-60 years of research and development and the million hours of manpower, 14 attempts of making the ideal 35mm lens has paid off. The photographs here are in red here, they are at f2, the ones in green are at f4, and the ones in purple are at f16. Wherever there's a star, that means that the lens is completely wide open, so some will be at f2 and some will be at f1.4. We have our first series of photographs here. These are all at f2. The middle ones here are all at 0.3 meters, and these other photographs were all taken around the 1.2 meter mark. We've got the APO Summicron, as you can see, the first one here, followed by the Summilux Leica 1.4, followed by the Summicron f2, this is a vintage lens, and then we've got the Nikkor 35 1.4, and the last one here is the Voigtlander 35 1.4. Alright, so well, let's have a look at the first two here. Comparing the APO 35, the latest one, with the Summilux f1.4. And what do we see? So if we go straight into the center, and now we're at 200%. We've got the Summicron here on the left and the Summilux 1.4 on the right, but they're both at f2. So do we see much difference between the two in the center? Not a great deal. Maybe the APO here. Maybe the APO has a bit more detail than the Summilux. Hard to tell. Let's move across to the side. As we move around towards the edges here, what do we see? And okay, once we get towards the edges here, maybe the APO Summicron has a little bit more contrast, but really they are both outstanding lenses. The Summilux does a fantastic job at f2. If we go to the top somewhere, let's see how it looks up here. Maybe at the top here we can see that the Summicron has more detail than the Summilux. Go across to the right here, you do notice a difference here again, that the APO is bringing up the goods. Very fine detail. Let's go to the corners here. What do we see? So maybe there's a bit more vignetting in the APO actually as it goes to the edges. And so the Summilux is actually stacking up really well. I mean, Summilux is stopped down one stop, so that possibly explains why there's a little bit less vignetting than the APO at f2 wide open. As far as detail in the corner, the APO I think probably gets it a little bit more detailed than the Summilux. You can see here in the squares, and in here as well. Yeah, you can see in the writing here there's some more detail. It's sharper in the APO compared to the Summilux, both at f2. Mind you, it is brighter here in the Summilux. You can see the 2000, whereas here it's harder to see. I suppose if we do some post-processing, we can probably bring all that up as well. But this is just looking at the raw file without any adjustment to the raw file. The old vintage Summicron. So we've got the APO on the left, and then we've got the Leica vintage Summicron f2. So both at f2. So they both stack up quite well. So the old vintage one stacks up quite well. I think there's more detail on the new APO. If we go to the top, let's have a look what we see. Yes, you can see straight away, as soon as you move away from the center, the new APO is without a doubt much clearer, higher definition, more contrast. You really notice it in the corners here. As you go to the corner here, we've got still lots of detail where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy on the old Summicron. And if we go across the other side, what do we see? We've got the same sort of thing. We're losing contrast in the old Summicron, and on the new APO 35 Summicron, it's looking really good. If we look at these solid blocks here of shading, you can really see how we've got dark. This is the Summicron, the old Summicron, vintage Summicron on the right here. You can see how there's a variance in the actual color density in these grey blocks here, whereas this is right in the corner here on the left corner, whereas the new APO, you can see how consistent it is across all those blocks of shaded grey. A big difference there. APO on the left and the Nikon on the right. Alright, so we've got the APO 35 Leica on the left and the Nikon 35 1.4 at f2. Both are at f2. What do we notice? Okay, look, the clarity and the detail with the Nikon is pretty good at f2. We do notice some pink and purples coming through, so I guess that's the color aberration in the lens. But once we start moving away from the center here, you can really see how the detail starts to drop off very quickly on the Nikon, whereas the detail on the APO Summicron is there, really great detail. If we go to the corner here, let's have a look, and you can see that the APO is much more detail. I'm not sure whether this is lens distortion there. You can see how this is quite elongated, and yeah, you can actually see how this whole line here is curved, where it's quite straighter, I should say, on the APOs, Leica APO. And yeah, you can see quite a bit of difference between the two lenses here towards the sides. If we go across to the other side, let's see what's happening there. And again, the Summicron on the left here is a lot more detailed than the Nikon. No surprises there. I already knew that the Nikon was a bit soft when the apertures are completely open, and you need to stop down quite a bit more to start to bring up the detail on the sides. So the Voigtlander here. Alright, now I had to take the Voigtlander a number of times because I found that I was missing the focus. But anyway, here you can see that I think I've missed the focus just a little bit on the Voigtlander, but otherwise the detail is pretty good. What I did notice with the Voigtlander is that the focus does change over the width of the frame. So if we go to the sides here, we've still got lots of detail in the APO, and we start to lose some of the detail here on the Voigtlander, but otherwise it's pretty good. You can see that there's a bit of the block here is starting to fade out at the edges here compared to the Leica APO Summicron. But otherwise the Voigtlander does a pretty good job considering it's 1/10 of the price. Go up to the top here. This is what I mean. So the center here, you can see that the Voigtlander is just a little bit off compared to the APO, but when we go to the top here, the detail in the Voigtlander actually starts to pick up. I noticed that with the Voigtlander is that the focus at the edges here is different to the focus at the center. If you get the center in focus, you'll find that the edges go out of focus. If you get this edge in the focus here, then the center goes out of focus. Just one of the peculiarities of the lens, I think. So obviously the idea is to get in focus in the center, I suppose, and then frame accordingly. Alright, now if we go to the right side, you can see the Voigtlander does a pretty good job. Okay, once we get to the very edge here, but we start to lose the details in the Voigtlander there. At this point, it's worth talking a little bit more about the Voigtlander. I like the Voigtlander because it was so small, so compact. I think it looks fantastic on the camera body. I had to do the test numerous times with the Voigtlander because I wasn't nailing the focus and I couldn't work out what was going on. With all the other lenses, I was setting it up on say 1.4 f2 and setting up the focus using live view and also checking with the rangefinder to make sure I had the right focus and everything was working fine. I did the same on the Voigtlander as well. But then as I was doing the tests and moving the aperture to the different positions, the 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6 and 16, I was getting some inconsistent focus results and I couldn't work out what was going on. Eventually, after doing numerous tests, both on the M10R and also on the Leica M240P, to see whether there was something peculiar about the cameras or what I was doing, and it was consistent across both cameras. After doing some research on the internet, well, I did find out some characteristics about this particular lens which I didn't know, is that the focus does shift. So you don't actually change the focus here, so the position of the lens doesn't change, but when you actually go from 1.4 to 5.6 and up to 16, the actual focus does change, and it's quite significant. So I was shooting at 1.2 meters, so that was at 1.4. When I went to about f4, f5.6, effectively the focus changed, and using live view I had actually moved the lens so it was showing about 1.1 meters instead of 1.2. When you look through the rangefinder, you actually see the images separate. It's quite significant. Now, what does that mean? If you're using the lens and you're using live view or you're using the electronic viewfinder, you don't have a problem because you're actually using focus peaking to actually get your focus, and you're seeing what the sensor sees. And I've shot this lens on my Leica film camera, so using just the rangefinder, I guess depending on the situation you're in, longer distances, if you've got a larger depth of field, you don't necessarily pick up that you've missed the focus. But in this test, it became really clear. Something to be aware of with this lens. So what does that mean? How does that affect me? The lens is great value for money. Love shooting it wide open at 1.4. However, what I'll probably do now is I'll use this lens on my Nikon Z6, the one I'm actually filming with right now, because then I'm always using the electronic viewfinder or the back screen to focus, which means I'll never have an issue with regards to what f-stop I'm using and nailing the focus. But if you're using this and only the rangefinder, you will miss the focus using just the rangefinder. At 1.4, the rangefinder is synced. At f16, the depth of field is so great it doesn't really matter. But around that f4, f5.6, what you see in the rangefinder is not what the lens sees. Something to know. Alright, on with the show. Okay, let's have a look at when we're actually using the close-up feature of the two lenses that I can compare, which is the APO Summicron. We're focusing at 0.32 meters, 32 centimeters, and also I've got the Nikon here. Right, so let's have a closer look, and straight away we notice lots of detail with the APO. Not as much detail in the Nikon, even though the Nikon does a pretty good job at f2. You notice some of this purple fringing coming up in the Nikon, but once we move away from the center, you can see how the Leica APO has got a lot of detail. The Nikon starts to lose some of the detail there, and as we go right to the edges there, you notice a big difference. And when we go right to the corner here, the APO Summicron has a very fine definition and a higher contrast and sharpness than the Nikon. Again, no surprises there. We already knew that from the previous tests when we were shooting at 1.2 meters. Alright, so now all these are at f4. We'll compare the Leica APO Summicron with the Summilux. Both are very good results. High contrast. The APO wins it, I think, just by a smidge. If we go across to the left here, it's both at f4, solid blocks, clear solid blocks. I think the APO is still a little bit better than the Summilux. I think that's true also here. The APO just a bit more contrast than the Summilux, but the definition and the clarity here is fantastic on both lenses. Zoom up to the top somewhere. The APO I think has got more detail there than the Summilux. Across to the right. They're pretty close to each other, but I think the APO still wins. And, down the bottom here, yeah, the APO is definitely better than the Summilux. Now that we've stopped down to f4, we've got rid of the vignetting that was in the APO Summicron, and you notice here shutter speed on the old Nikon f2 is starting to show up in the image about the same on both. But both lenses produce spectacular results. Vintage Summicron on the right, and the new APO Summicron on the left, both at f4. The new APO is definitely better, more detail than the older vintage Summicron. We go across to the left. Again, no real surprises there. Mind you, the vintage Summicron has improved considerably, whereas at f2, when it was wide open there, you really notice how these blocks were starting to break up on the left hand side near the left edge here, where it's gone quite solid, so you're getting a nice good definition here at f4. So really the old Summicron f2 vintage lens is stacking up really nicely at f4 compared to f2. Go across to the right hand side, and again you see that the blocks here now have gone all solid and clear, and we've got lots of definition. No complaints there. And down here also really good clarity, lots of detail, a great image. You do still notice that the new APO Summicron has that much more detail right smack in the corners compared to the old one. Lost some detail, quite a bit of detail there, goes fuzzy. I call that character, I suppose, on the old vintage Summicron. How does the Nikon stack up? Summicron APO on the left and the Nikon on the right. The pink aberrations, color aberrations, I think are still there. But as far as the detail and the clarity is concerned, the Nikon's really stacking up now in the center. Let's see what happens towards the top there. It's cleared up a lot, improving quite a bit once you stop it down to f4. Once we get to the edges here, it's improved a lot. And if we come back down here, I mean, the APO Summicron is still far better than the Nikon. You can see the big difference there. Come across to the left hand side here. The APO Summicron far better than the Nikon. Voigtlander, let's see how they stack up. APO Summicron on the left, Voigtlander on the right. It's out of focus there. You can see what I mean by the Voigtlander seems to have this thing going on where the edges here, on the edges, it's, you know, just as sharp on the edges as the APO Summicron, but the center is out of focus. So the focus does change from the center outwards quite considerably when you're looking at it this sort of level. Something to be aware of. I guess you put that down to character again on the Voigtlander. And if we go to the edges here, okay, the APO Summicron is still better than the Voigtlander, but you can see how it's really great detail on the sides here. If we go down to the bottom, again, more detail in the APO. So Leica APO on the left and the Nikon on the right. So the Nikon, once it's stopped down to f4, it's looking quite good in the center. Towards the edges there, the APO remains high in definition. We start to see some of the pin cushioning effect on the Nikon. The APO is giving me much better contrast, more detail on the sides compared to the Nikon. Quite a bit of distortion on the Nikon compared to the APO. Let's have a look and see what happens at f16. Summicron on the left, Summilux on the right. Both looking fantastic. Going up to the top here, both looking fantastic. Going to the right, both looking fantastic. There is more distortion in the Summilux. Across to the left hand side, what do we see? Great detail, great definition. The APO Summicron, I think, is just slightly more detailed than Summilux. So the new APO Summicron on the left and the old vintage Summicron on the right. Both looking fantastic in the center. Details at the top here, great. Details on the right here, great. So it looks like the Summicron again, stop down, produces wonderful results. Down here, what do we see? Yeah, look, the Nikon is cleared up completely. Nice detail. So the Summicron, the old vintage Summicron, is really coming up, showing its goods. Even at f16, it's actually producing a really good image. And here you can see the depth of field has increased considerably. So we've got detail right across to the bottom left-hand corner. Great result, I think. Both lenses. The old vintage Summicron stacks up very nicely. More contrast, I think, in the new APO, but really the old vintage Summicron does a great job, I think. And the final test is what happens at wide open. So we're looking at the APO Summicron and the Leica Summilux wide open. So the APO Summicron at f2 and the Leica Summilux at f1.4 on the right. The 1.4, you can see great detail, impressive lens. Once we get to the top here, you can see that the 1.4 is not quite as clear as the APO Summicron on the left. If we go to the right hand side, same sort of thing. The APO Summicron, which you would expect wide open at f2, is going to have more detail than the Leica Summilux at f1.4. You notice it here on the right hand side compared to the APO on the left hand side here. Go across to the other side, and same sort of thing, but really the Leica 1.4 Summilux does a fantastic job at 1.4. Look at this, solid blocks here, solid greys right on the very edge of the photograph. I'm so impressed with both lenses, both the 1.4 Summilux as well as the new APO Summicron. Outstanding. So we've got the APO Summicron on the left and the Nikon on the right. So this is what I already know this about the Nikon 35 1.4. You take it down to 1.4 and it goes really soft. You get all sorts of color aberration going on, chromatic aberration in the lens, and gets really quite soft. Contrast drops off quite considerably. Go towards edges here, and you know, you still got a lot of detail there, but you just get soft detail. So I guess it's part of the character of the lens. Quite good for portrait, black and white portrait, where you're not really concerned about the color and the color aberration that happens. As far as the solids are concerned, it actually does quite a good job. You can see how the solids are still solid. The solids aren't breaking up on the edges. So really the little Nikon does quite a good job, I think. Alright, let's have a look. The Voigtlander at 1.4 compared to the Apple Summicron. Going towards the center here. It does a better job at 1.4 than f16, I think, the Voigtlander. We go to the top here, it's not bad, it's pretty good. It's better than the Nikon, I think. And if we go back to the edges here, you see distortion. Obviously it's not as clear as the Apple, but I think it is better than the Nikon. Oh, alright, what other thing? Yes, another test that I'll do is a test of flare, how much flare there is between the lenses. I tested only 4 of the lenses, so I didn't test the Nikon. I set up a little flare test with a torch, and I'll quickly show you those. Well, this is my setup for the flare test. I've got the camera there, I've got a torch over there. I've positioned the camera so it's facing in that direction there, which means the torch will be in the frame somehow. And I positioned the torch and the camera so that it would actually purposely create some flare as well. And then if we look at the back of the camera, let's just see what we're seeing. Using the live view on the back of the camera, we can see what sort of impact we're having with the torch shining into the lens and then seeing how much flare there is. So we'll have a look at the first lens, and what have we got? In this case here, we've got the old vintage Summicron. There's no good or bad here. It's just really a case of what sort of flare do you get, what sort of images can you create with that flare, and can you use it to your advantage. Obviously in my lounge room here, it's not exactly a very artistic shot other than just showing the flare. So the Summicron creates these wonderful rings which reminds me of some of the old Nikon lenses which produce a similar effect. And quite creative, isn't it, with all these wonderful circles. This is the Voigtlander. I can't remember what aperture I was using, but let's assume for now that it is f4. What's the difference? It's, well, probably a bit less flaring than the Summicron, the old vintage Summicron. Definitely not as many circles as the Summicron. Okay, let's have a look at, this is a Summilux, a 35mm 1.4 Summilux, and that creates a different type of effect. Less than the Voigtlander and less than the, but it's a different type of effect again, isn't it? With the, that's what it is. That's the flaring that you see with the Summilux. And then the APO. APO reduces the flaring even for 35mm Summicron APO, which I was expecting to reduce the flaring considerably more. So just looking at those all again. So they've got the vintage Summicron, the Voigtlander, the Summilux, and the Apple Summicron. Yes, there is some flare, and again, it's more about knowing what your lens does and how you're going to use that flare to your advantage when you're taking the photograph. Right, well, the results are in. The conclusion. The Apple 35mm Summicron takes the cake, gets #1 podium. It's without a doubt the finest lens that's been produced out of the ones that I have, and I guess from what people have been saying around the world, including Leica, it's one of the best lenses that they've made. In fact, Peter Carber, who's the optics design for Leica lenses, states himself that the best lens he's made is the 35mm Apple Summicron, which is for the SL, much larger, about 3 times larger than the one for the M. But his charter was to make the M version lens, the Apple Summicron 35mm, to be as close as possible, as good as the one that he's made for the SL range. Anyway, it stacks up as far as I'm concerned. It's given me also another appreciation for the existing 35mm f1.4 Summilux lens. Incredible lens. The Voigtlander also gets a high mention because of its high quality and a significantly less price, a factor of about 8, I think, difference. The vintage Summicron, well, it has its own character, so that's what you buy it for, the character. and also the Nikon 35mm f1.4. I remember when I first got it, because I was comparing it to my Nikon 50mm f1.4, and that seemed to be much sharper at 1.4 than the 35mm at 1.4. Well, anyway, this test also stacks up. It shows that. I think that's it. It's a big video. I hope you find it useful. Give it a thumbs up if you do. Really appreciate your support by giving those thumbs up, and it helps with YouTube algorithms, etc. If it's the first time to my channel, please do subscribe to my channel. Press subscribe, and press notifications. You'll be notified when the next video is out. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Thanks. Cheers. Bye.